There's a silent storm raging inside the heart of someone who avoids intimacy, and it only awakens when the one person who truly saw them walks away. This immediately draws attention, creates tension, and hits deep emotional resonance. We often think that avoidants are untouchable, that their walls make them immune to heartbreak. But the truth is, when a super empath, the one who sees all the hidden cracks, all the unspoken fears, detaches, something incredible happens. The person who ran from closeness now faces the very thing they've avoided, the raw, aching void of longing and regret. For months, maybe years, they've convinced themselves that detachment is safety. They've kept hearts at a distance, avoided vulnerability, and controlled love like a fortress. But love has a way of slipping through even the strongest defenses. And when someone who truly understood them walks away, the walls crumble. Not because they wanted it, but because now they're forced to confront their own pain. This pain is different. It's quiet, it's relentless, and it's invisible to the world. It doesn't scream, it doesn't beg. It whispers, reminding them of every opportunity lost, every tender moment they pushed away, every chance they denied themselves the warmth they secretly craved. Pause for effect, let it resonate. Today, I want to talk about that pain. The one that destroys avoidance after the super empath detaches, not to shame them, not to vilify them, but to understand the depth of what happens when someone who runs from intimacy is left to face the heartbreak of someone who loved without walls. They say avoidants are cold, that they are somehow immune to the deeper currents of love, but that is one of the greatest misconceptions about them. What most people fail to see is that behind the carefully constructed walls, behind the practiced indifference and the well-rehearsed detachment, there is an ocean of emotion that is rarely acknowledged, often denied, and almost never expressed. The pain that avoidants carry is not the kind that is visible to the world. It doesn't announce itself with tears or with desperate confessions. Instead, it lurks quietly, hidden beneath layers of self-protection, growing slowly, shaping their thoughts, their choices, and ultimately their ability to connect with anyone in a genuine way. To witness an avoidant from the outside might feel like observing someone who has it all together, someone who is unshakable in their independence and seemingly unaffected by the complexities of human intimacy. But the truth is, that calm exterior is not the absence of feeling. It is the careful choreography of fear. Avoidants have learned early in life, often unconsciously, that vulnerability can be dangerous. They have felt, perhaps repeatedly, that opening up, giving trust, or allowing themselves to be seen exposes them to rejection, disappointment, or emotional overload. Over time, these experiences create a protective pattern. If you don't let anyone in fully, no one can hurt you completely. What emerges from this is not indifference, but a sophisticated defense mechanism. They become adept at managing appearances, at controlling the emotional temperature of their relationships, so they never have to feel too much, too fast, or too deeply. The paradox is that in their efforts to avoid pain, they cultivate it in secret. Every step back, every withheld word, every moment of emotional distance is like a small stone added to an invisible pile that weighs down their hearts. The outside world sees strength, the inside world feels tension, unease, and longing that is rarely named. This hidden pain is subtle at first. It can manifest as a restlessness that they cannot explain, an inexplicable sense of dissatisfaction, even in moments of superficial success or comfort. They may find themselves avoiding certain emotional triggers, steering clear of situations that could lead to intimacy, or shutting down when someone begins to approach them with genuine care. They tell themselves that these choices are rational, that they are protecting themselves from inevitable disappointment. And in a sense, they are shielding themselves from a type of hurt that feels unbearable because it would force them to confront the parts of themselves they've long tried to ignore. But what they don't always recognize is that this shield, while protective, is also isolating. The more they hide, the more they feel the emptiness accumulate, and the less capable they become of experiencing the very connection they secretly crave. Avoidants are not unaware of the irony of their own patterns. Deep down, they feel the longing that pulses beneath their defenses, the quiet ache that emerges when they witness others loving freely, when they see moments of tenderness they themselves have turned away from. There is a paradoxical tension within them, a desire for closeness coupled with an instinctive pull away from it. This tension is exhausting, and it leaves an imprint on their hearts that they rarely articulate. They may distract themselves with work, hobbies, or superficial relationships, convincing themselves that they are content, but in the stillness of their own minds, the truth is unavoidable. The pain is there, persistent, whispering reminders of every time they held back, every time they refused to lean in, every time they chose safety over vulnerability. It is a pain without applause or recognition, and it thrives in secrecy. The intensity of this hidden pain becomes most apparent when the avoidant is faced with someone who pierces their defenses, someone who sees through the carefully maintained distance. That rare connection, that genuine empathy triggers a confrontation with their own emotional truths. For the avoidant, the presence of such a person is both intoxicating and terrifying. They are drawn to the authenticity, to the depth of feeling, yet the intensity threatens the very mechanisms they have relied upon to maintain stability. When the connection is present, it magnifies the pain they have carried quietly, exposing it in ways they can neither fully control nor escape. And when that connection departs, when the empath detaches or withdraws, the weight of the previously hidden pain becomes undeniable. The avoidant is left with an emotional landscape they can no longer ignore, and the carefully managed equilibrium they relied upon collapses, leaving rawness in its wake. In essence, the pain of an avoidant is both a consequence and a paradox of their survival strategy. Their avoidance is a way of coping, a way of keeping themselves safe from the chaos and unpredictability of intimate connection, yet it is simultaneously the source of profound inner suffering. They are like a fortress whose walls protect against the world but trap the heart within. Every attempt to control distance, to regulate emotion, to avoid confrontation feeds the quiet torment that lives in the corners of their mind. It is a slow, persistent, invisible erosion that few see, but it shapes every decision they make, every relationship they enter, and every moment they choose to step back from love. Avoidants carry this pain privately, often alone, because their patterns make it difficult to share or articulate. They fear judgment, rejection, and exposure, and so they internalize their struggle. And yet the depth of their feeling, the intensity of what is hidden, is nothing short of extraordinary. It is a reminder that human hearts are rarely as simple as they appear, that appearances of strength often mask vulnerability, and that the most resilient exteriors can conceal the most sensitive, fragile interiors. This pain, while silent and often misunderstood, is a testament to the complexity of love, fear, and the human desire to both connect and protect oneself simultaneously. There is something extraordinary about a person who truly sees another human being in the depth of their unspoken struggles. The super empath is not someone who simply notices surface-level emotions or reacts to what is easy to detect. They are people who feel beneath the layers, who perceive the subtle tremors of the heart that others overlook. When they encounter an avoidant, someone who has built a fortress around their emotions, they do not recoil or retreat. Instead, they lean in with a quiet insistence, with a patience that is almost uncomfortable in its constancy, and with a sensitivity that allows them to recognize the smallest cracks in the armor. The super empath does not demand change or pressurize the avoidant into revealing themselves, but they are consistent in their perception. They are present even when it feels unsafe to be seen, and in that presence they become mirrors reflecting the hidden vulnerabilities that the avoidant has long denied or suppressed. Avoidants often live in a state of emotional camouflage. They have mastered the art of appearing unaffected, of controlling how much of themselves they allow the world to witness. Yet, no matter how sophisticated the defense, the super empath detects what lies underneath. It is not magic, but a heightened awareness born from their own deep capacity to feel. They are attuned to subtle cues, a fleeting hesitation in a word, a momentary shadow in a glance, a small gesture that contradicts the otherwise composed exterior. These fragments of truth, often invisible to the casual observer, become the threads by which the empath understands the avoidant. They are not satisfied with surface-level interaction. They seek connection with the essence of the person, the part of them that has been shielded from intimacy out of fear. In doing so, they awaken a complexity of emotion in the avoidant that has often lain dormant for years. The presence of a super empath in an avoidant's life is both exhilarating and terrifying. On one hand, there is a magnetic attraction to someone who can hold space for the avoidant's hidden self without judgment. There is relief in being understood, and a deep sense of comfort in knowing that someone can tolerate the intensity of the walls they have built. For the avoidant, this is a rare experience, one that challenges their usual patterns of distance and detachment. On the other hand, it is disarming. To be truly seen is to be vulnerable, and vulnerability is precisely what the avoidant has spent a lifetime avoiding. The empath's recognition of their inner struggles confronts them with truths they would rather ignore, and it forces them to confront the tension between the desire for intimacy and the instinct to protect themselves. This dynamic is both intoxicating and destabilizing because it brings the avoidant face to face with the emotional reality they have long evaded. What is remarkable is that the super empath does not simply enable the avoidant's avoidance. They do not chase or cling in a way that would provoke resistance. Instead, they offer a consistent, empathetic presence that allows the avoidant to gradually encounter the emotions they have hidden. This slow, deliberate exposure to authenticity is transformative. The avoidant may not immediately recognize it, may even resist it, but beneath the surface, the impact is profound. They begin to feel feelings they thought were inaccessible. They begin to recognize patterns of avoidance they were not consciously aware of. They begin to experience the quiet tremor of connection that challenges their assumptions about what love and intimacy might feel like. In this way, the super empath is not only a witness to their pain, but also a catalyst for self-awareness and growth. Their ability to see deeply into another person's heart is not an intrusion. It is a gift that the avoidant may only fully appreciate in hindsight, often after the empath has detached. Super empaths also have an uncanny ability to hold the avoidant accountable without provoking defensiveness. They do not force explanations or demand emotional confessions. Instead, they create an environment in which honesty and vulnerability are gently encouraged. This is crucial because avoidants often associate emotional expression with risk or danger. The empath's presence demonstrates that there is a way to exist fully seen without being overwhelmed or rejected. Yet, paradoxically, this very capability to witness and hold space can be the source of profound pain for the avoidant once the empath detaches. The avoidant has, for the first time, experienced what it feels like to be understood on a level that bypasses the defenses they have relied on for so long. The absence of that understanding when the empath leaves magnifies the sense of loss. The avoidant is confronted with the full weight of the emotions they had carefully hidden, and they must grapple with the reality that someone once loved them in the entirety of their complexity, and that love is no longer present. The empath's impact is cumulative. Every moment they show patience, every instance they notice a subtle emotion, every gesture of unconditional acknowledgement builds a bridge to the avoidant's hidden self. Over time, the SE bridges create a tension between the safety of avoidance and the longing for genuine connection. The avoidant begins to sense what has been missing, not just the affection, but the rare and profound recognition of who they truly are. This is why the super empath is so transformative. They do not simply love the avoidant, they illuminate the avoidant's own capacity to feel and to be known. They remind the avoidant of the parts of themselves they have denied or suppressed, and in doing so, they awaken a depth of longing and regret that is as intense as it is subtle. Ultimately, the super empath's gift is that they reveal the avoidant's hidden truth. They hold a mirror that the avoidant cannot ignore. They make it impossible for the avoidant to continue hiding from themselves without consequences. Every empathic touch, every moment of understanding, every silent recognition of inner pain leaves a lasting imprint. It is this gift and the subsequent withdrawal that makes the avoidance experience so profound. They are left with the knowledge of what connection could have been, of what love might have felt like, and of the stark contrast between avoidance and the depth of human intimacy. In that contrast lies both the beauty and the agony of their emotional awakening, a process that begins with being truly seen and often ends with the painful realization of what has been lost. For an avoidant, detachment has always been a shield, a carefully maintained boundary designed to protect them from vulnerability, from exposure, from the intensity of feelings they fear they cannot control. They have practiced it, honed it, and in many ways relied upon it to navigate relationships without losing themselves. And yet, when someone who has truly seen them, the super empath, pulls away, that very detachment they relied on becomes a source of profound confrontation. The departure of the empath feels like a betrayal, not in the sense of being intentionally wronged, but in the sense that the avoidant is suddenly faced with the reality of their own limitations. They have lived so long in a world where distance equals safety, that being left behind, being abandoned even indirectly by the one person who could reach them, ignites a panic unlike anything they have experienced before. It is as if the walls they built for protection now cage them in their own regret, and every step they took to avoid pain is suddenly illuminated as a step that contributed to this unbearable sense of loss. The intensity of this feeling is often unexpected to the avoidant themselves. For so long, they have operated under the illusion that they are detached, that they can regulate their emotions and maintain control over the depth of connection. But when the empath leaves, the illusion shatters. The absence of someone who understood them completely forces them to confront the emotional void they have avoided all their life. The panic comes not from a fear of losing the person, but from the recognition of what they were incapable of holding on to. The avoidant is left staring into the consequences of their own patterns, and for the first time, the cost of their self-protective strategies is undeniable. What had been an abstract idea, that avoiding vulnerability has consequences, now becomes a vivid, inescapable reality. The emptiness left by the departure of the empath is not just absence, it is a mirror reflecting the choices the avoidant made, the opportunities they refused, and the love they could not sustain. This sense of betrayal is unique because it is self-inflicted, yet it feels like an external wound. The avoidant often oscillates between anger at themselves and frustration at the empath for leaving, though the truth is that the empath's departure is rarely malicious. They leave because they cannot remain in a space where their depth of feeling is unreciprocated or where their emotional investment is unbalanced. For the avoidant, this dynamic is both confusing and devastating. They may struggle to understand why the person who loved them so deeply would walk away, interpreting it as abandonment rather than the natural consequence of their own emotional distance. This misinterpretation amplifies the pain because it externalizes the source of the hurt while masking the underlying truth that the avoidance detachment created the conditions for loss. The betrayal they feel is double-edged. It is both directed outward toward the one who left and inward toward the self that could not rise to the depth of connection offered to them. As the initial shock of the empath's detachment settles, the avoidant begins to experience the subtle, persistent ache of regret. Every interaction, every tender moment that was squandered, every opportunity to lean into vulnerability comes rushing back with a clarity that is impossible to ignore. Memories of conversations that could have deepened intimacy, of gestures that went unappreciated, and of emotional closeness that was resisted become acute in their awareness. The avoidant begins to feel the consequences of their own choices in a way they have never felt before. It is not dramatic or loud. It is quiet, internal, and relentless. Unlike the sudden rush of anger or disappointment, this pain is patient. It lingers, gnaws at the edges of thought, and infiltrates moments when the avoidant thought they had moved on. They cannot escape it because it is intimately tied to the truth they have long avoided. They have lost something rare, something transformative, and it is gone because of the very patterns they relied upon to stay safe. The departure of the super empath also triggers a confrontation with fear in a new, intensified form. Avoidants have always feared being overwhelmed, being engulfed by emotion, but now they face the reality of what they cannot control, absence, loss, and the intensity of what they truly wanted but could not claim. This fear is different from their usual defensive anxiety because it is not abstract or hypothetical. It is tangible, lived, and unavoidable. The avoidant begins to wrestle with questions they had long suppressed. What if I never find this level of understanding again? What if the love I resisted was the love I was meant to experience? What if I am forever incapable of giving myself fully to someone who truly sees me? These questions do not come as fleeting thoughts. They are relentless companions, forcing the avoidant to examine the consequences of their emotional avoidance with unflinching honesty. Even more, the avoidant experiences a sense of disorientation. For years, they may have defined themselves by their independence, their emotional control, and their ability to manage distance without consequence. But the empath's detachment undermines that identity. Suddenly, the avoidant is confronted with the fact that their strategy for survival, detachment, was not protective in the way they believed. It did not shield them from heartbreak, rather, it ensured that when love touched them, the resulting pain would be magnified by absence and loss. This realization is destabilizing because it forces the avoidant to confront a profound truth, the very thing they feared. Emotional vulnerability is also the thing that could have brought them profound fulfillment. The tension between what they wanted and what they allowed themselves to have becomes a source of internal conflict that is deeply disorienting and inescapable. Ultimately, the avoidance experience of betrayal is not about the empath themselves, but about the awakening of their own consciousness. The departure of someone who loved them fully illuminates the cost of emotional avoidance in a way nothing else could. The avoidant is left with an acute awareness of the gap between their potential for connection and their habitual retreat from intimacy. It is a confrontation with themselves, their choices, and the consequences of protecting their heart at the expense of being truly known. This pain is uniquely theirs, intense yet quiet, and it carries with it the power to transform, but only if they are willing to face the very truths they have spent a lifetime avoiding. Regret is a quiet, insidious companion, and for the avoidant, it often arrives after the fact, when the super empath has already withdrawn, leaving a space that is impossible to fill. Unlike immediate emotional pain, which is raw and reactive, regret settles slowly, pressing against the mind with persistent insistence, reminding the avoidant of every misstep, every hesitation, and every opportunity they allowed to slip through their fingers. It is a pain without catharsis, because there is no one to blame, and yet its weight feels unbearably heavy. For months, years, even decades, the avoidant may have told themselves that detachment was the key to emotional survival, that maintaining distance was a necessary form of self-preservation. And yet, in the absence of the person who truly saw them, they are confronted with the bitter truth. Every moment they held back, every time they chose safety over intimacy, has contributed to the emptiness now pressing down upon them. The nature of regret for the avoidant is paradoxical. They are both the architect and the victim of their own emotional patterns. They built walls to protect themselves, and in doing so, they also built barriers between themselves and the very experiences of love and connection that could have enriched their lives. Every end a moment that they resisted, every word left unsaid, every gesture of vulnerability avoided, becomes a ghost that haunts their consciousness. It is as if the mind plays an endless reel of what could have been, showing the avoidant images of love denied, of closeness that was possible but never realized. And because they are so intimately aware of the mechanics of their own distance, the timing, the fear, the instinct to retreat, they cannot hide from themselves. They know exactly where they went wrong, and that knowledge sharpens the pain, making it both inescapable and intensely personal. The intensity of regret is magnified by the unique nature of the super empath, Unlike casual partners or fleeting connections, the super empath penetrates the avoidance defenses in a way that few ever can. They do not simply scratch the surface, they see into the core, into the fears, the insecurities, the suppressed desires, and the hidden longings that the avoidant has carefully contained. To have someone of such depth understand them, validate them, and hold space for them creates an experience of intimacy that is rare, transformative, and, for the avoidant, almost dangerous. It is exhilarating because it hints at what life could feel like when walls are lowered, and terrifying because it exposes vulnerability the avoidant has worked for so long to protect. When the empath leaves, the regret is not just about what was lost externally, but about the internal awakening that is abruptly cut short. The sudden realization of what the avoidant could have allowed themselves to feel, but did not. Regret in this context is layered, multidimensional, and relentless. It is not simply about wishing things had been different. It is about recognizing patterns of avoidance that have governed a lifetime. The avoidant begins to understand, often too late, that the very strategies that seemed protective were also self-limiting. Every act of emotional distance, every refusal to lean in, every retreat from connection now appears not as wisdom, but as a series of lost chances. They replay conversations, re-examine moments of hesitation, and scrutinize the small choices that cumulatively led to the empath's detachment. The mind becomes a theater of if only and what might have been, and the heart aches not only for the person who left, but for the part of themselves that could have embraced love but chose fear instead. This regret also carries a sense of inevitability. The avoidant realizes that the departure of the empath was not random, nor was it caused by superficial misunderstandings. It was the natural outcome of an imbalance. One person giving fully, the other shielding fully, unable to meet the depth of feeling offered. This recognition intensifies the emotional burden because it frames the loss not as an accident, but as a consequence of conscious and unconscious choices. The avoidant cannot externalize blame entirely. They cannot fully comfort themselves with excuses or rationalizations. They know at some level that they could have acted differently, could have leaned in rather than away, could have allowed themselves to be vulnerable instead of retreating. This awareness is both painful and transformative because it is precise, personal, and undeniable. Regret for the avoidant often becomes a lens through which they reassess every relationship, every encounter, and every emotional risk they have taken. They begin to see a pattern, moments of withdrawal, pauses in intimacy, hesitations when closeness was possible, all leading to the same outcome, a series of missed opportunities, one more painful than the last. Unlike immediate heartbreak, which can be displaced or numbed, this form of regret is cumulative. It builds silently over time, shaping their perceptions, their interactions, and their capacity to trust themselves with love in the future. Each memory of closeness denied becomes a lesson etched in their emotional consciousness, a warning that fear-driven avoidance carries consequences far beyond temporary comfort. And yet, within this regret lies the seeds of growth, though it is often bitter and difficult to recognize. The avoid. Dant is confronted with the reality of their emotional patterns in a way that cannot be ignored. They are forced to acknowledge the depth of what they avoided and the cost of the strategies they relied upon. Every memory of tenderness rejected, every moment of connection denied, becomes a mirror reflecting their own limitations, and in that reflection, there is a chance for self-awareness. The intensity of the regret may feel unbearable, but it is also precise, targeted, and instructive, revealing exactly where the avoidant has closed themselves off and what it might take to break the cycle in the future. The super empath's departure, then, is both a catalyst and a teacher. The avoidant experiences regret not merely for losing someone, but for realizing the magnitude of what they were capable of feeling and sharing, and for understanding the gaps between desire and action, between longing and presence. This regret is painful because it is intimately personal, inescapable, and tied to the very nature of the avoidance emotional architecture. It is a quiet, persistent ache that lingers long after the empath is gone, reminding the avoidant that love is not something to be calculated, avoided, or controlled. It is something to be fully experienced or risk losing forever. Loneliness is a strange and complex companion for the avoidant. They have spent a lifetime cultivating distance, convincing themselves that solitude is preferable to the risk of being hurt, that independence is freedom, and that emotional detachment is safety. And for a long time, this narrative can feel accurate. Loneliness becomes a background noise rather than an intrusive pain, a familiar state that they've learned to tolerate. But when a super empath detaches, the experience of loneliness transforms into something acute, something visceral, and something inescapable. It is no longer merely a quiet abs. Hence, it becomes a tangible force pressing against the soul, a constant reminder of what was once possible and what has now been lost. The avoidant, who once believed they could manage solitude with ease, finds themselves facing the stark reality that being alone without that emotional connection is profoundly destabilizing. The absence of the super empath illuminates the depth of the void the avoidant has tried to ignore. Their walls, once thought to be protective, now feel suffocating. Every instinct that once encouraged retreat from intimacy suddenly feels inadequate against the vastness of the emptiness that the empath's detachment has revealed. Loneliness becomes layered with regret, tinged with longing, and weighted by the realization that the person who once saw and understood them is no longer there. For an avoidant, this is a particularly cruel experience because it forces them to confront feelings they have long suppressed. The emotions that were once kept at a distance, vulnerability, desire, affection, and grief, come rushing in, unfiltered and undeniable. And unlike casual heartbreak, this loneliness is not a fleeting discomfort. It is persistent enough to occupy thoughts, affect behavior, and reshape perceptions of self and love. What makes this loneliness particularly painful is the avoidance awareness of what it is tied to. They are not simply alone, they are alone in the aftermath of having been intimately seen and understood, in the absence of the one person who could have offered them an emotional sanctuary. Every memory of moments where the empath truly connected with them becomes amplified, a stark contrast to the current void. The gestures, the words, the understanding all become reminders of what is no longer accessible, and they cannot be erased. In solitude, the avoidant is forced to reckon with the gap between the experience they had, the glimpse of emotional intimacy, and the reality they now face. This awareness is both illuminating and agonizing because it reveals the consequences of their avoidance, magnifying the pain beyond mere absence to a profound recognition of what has been lost forever. Loneliness also strips away the illusions the avoidant has maintained about self-sufficiency. They may have prided themselves on their independence, believed in their ability to navigate life without emotional reliance on others, and even romanticized detachment as a form of wisdom. But in the wake of a super empath's departure, all of these notions feel hollow. The avoidant discovers that no matter how self-reliant they appear, humans are wired for connection, and emotional isolation exacts a cost. The very strategies that once seemed like strength now reveal themselves as limitations, and the avoidant must grapple with the painful truth that they cannot escape the human need to be truly seen and understood. Loneliness becomes not just an absence of presence, but an absence of meaning, warmth, and resonance, things that only another person's empathy and depth could provide. The emotional intensity of loneliness is further complicated by the avoidant's internal dialogue. They often blame themselves for the absence, recognizing the choices they made to retreat and protect themselves. They replay moments when they could have leaned in, spoken their truth, or allowed vulnerability to flourish, realizing that each decision to withdraw contributed to the solitude they now experience. This self-awareness intensifies the loneliness, turning it into a mirror that reflects both the current void and the cumulative cost of their avoidance. The absence of the empath is not simply external, it is intertwined with the avoidant's own understanding of what they could have done differently, leaving them isolated with loss and accountability. The unique nature of the super empath amplifies the avoidant's sense of solitude. Unlike casual acquaintances or superficial connections, the empath had the rare ability to penetrate their defenses and create a space of authentic recognition. To be deeply understood in that way is a rare human experience, and when it is removed, the absence feels disproportionate, almost cruel in its magnitude. The avoidant is left not just alone, but acutely aware of the depth of the emotional connection they had encountered and the impossibility of replicating it easily. Every other interaction pales in comparison, every other relationship feels inadequate, and the loneliness is intensified by the memory of what could have been. The avoidant is left navigating a landscape where connection feels distant, almost unreachable, and every attempt to fill the void externally feels insufficient. This loneliness also has a psychological effect that can be destabilizing. Avoidants, who are accustomed to controlling their emotions and environments, now find themselves confronted with feelings they cannot manage through distance, distraction, or rationalization. The solitude forces introspection, and in that introspection, they confront not only the absence of the empath, but also the emptiness within themselves that has long been masked by avoidance. Loneliness, in this sense, becomes both a teacher and a tormentor. It reveals the depth of the avoidant's suppressed emotions while simultaneously demanding that they sit with discomfort they are unaccustomed to enduring. Every moment of solitude becomes a confrontation with what was lost, what was avoided, and what could have been embraced. And yet, within this intense loneliness, there is an undeniable clarity. The avoidant begins to see the emotional consequences of their patterns with unflinching honesty. The absent of the empath strips away illusions of invulnerability, revealing the truth that love, connection, and vulnerability are not optional if one seeks true fulfillment. The loneliness is painful because it is instructive. It teaches the avoidant the cost of avoidance, the weight of missed opportunities, and the profound human need for emotional intimacy. Every thought, every ache, every memory becomes a subtle guide, illuminating the consequences of retreat and the value of presence, empathy, and openness in relationships. There is a moment in every avoidance journey after the super empath detaches when the pain becomes too loud to ignore, when the avoidance that once felt protective begins to feel like a prison. For so long, avoidants have relied on distance as their strategy, convincing themselves that by retreating, by maintaining control over their emotions, they are protecting themselves from heartbreak. But in the wake of a super empath's departure, that carefully constructed distance is revealed for what it truly is, a barrier not to pain but to growth. The avoidant is suddenly forced to look at themselves with clarity, to confront the patterns they have cultivated, and to acknowledge the truth that they cannot hide from the consequences of their own avoidance. This is the moment when self-awareness is born, not gently, not softly, but with the intensity of a storm that refuses to be ignored. Avoidants are often uncomfortable with introspection because it challenges the narrative they have relied on for so long, that emotional distance equals safety. When the empath leaves, however, there is no narrative to fall back on. The absence of someone who truly saw them, who penetrated their walls without judgment, creates a void that cannot be rationalized away. For the first time, they are confronted with the stark contrast between what they have allowed themselves to feel and what they could have embraced fully. Every memory of connection, every moment of empathy becomes a mirror, reflecting not only the love that is gone, but also the emotional potential they have habitually denied themselves. This confrontation with self is intense, unavoidable, and deeply instructive. It forces the avoidant to recognize that avoidance, while it may have felt like protection, has also been the source of profound limitation. Self-awareness for the avoidant often arrives as a mix of pain and revelation. It is painful because it exposes the cost of emotional avoidance in a way that cannot be ignored, showing the gaps between desire and action, between longing and presence. They begin to see the patterns that have governed their lives with uncomfortable precision, moments of hesitation, retreats when vulnerability was possible, silences that should have been filled with expression. Each realization carries weight, and collectively they paint a picture of opportunities missed, intimacy avoided, and love deferred. The avoidant begins to understand that the pain they feel is not just about loss, but about self-imposed limitation, a direct consequence of the emotional walls they built to protect themselves. At the same time, this self-awareness is revealing. It shows them the capacity for emotional depth that they may have underestimated in themselves. The avoidant sees that when they allowed themselves to be truly vulnerable, they were capable of profound connection, empathy, and responsiveness. They recognize, sometimes too late, that the very avoidance that they relied on to stay safe prevented them from experiencing the full spectrum of human intimacy. The juxtaposition is sharp. The realization of what was possible and the acknowledgement of what was lost coexist in a way that is both devastating and enlightening. It is this duality, the mingling of regret and recognition, that catalyzes a level of self-understanding the avoidant has rarely encountered. The process of self-awareness also illuminates the avoidant's fears in a way that is unavoidable. For years, they may have rationalized withdrawal as wisdom, convincing themselves that emotional detachment is a strength rather than a limitation. But the empath's departure exposes the cost of these fears. The avoidance of pain has not prevented suffering. It has only postponed it, concentrated it, and intensified it. The avoidant sees clearly how fear of intimacy has shaped their life, how it has influenced their decisions, and how it has constrained their ability to experience love fully. This confrontation is disorienting because it strips away the defenses that have defined them and leaves them with a raw, unfiltered awareness of their own emotional architecture. The avoidant is forced to confront questions they have long avoided. What am I afraid of losing? What am I unwilling to risk? What patterns am I repeating that prevent me from being fully known and fully connected? With this heightened self-awareness comes a new kind of responsibility, one that is both liberating and challenging. The avoidant begins to realize that while they cannot change the past, they can recognize the patterns that have caused pain and consciously choose to respond differently in the future. The awareness of their own avoidance is not merely intellectual, it is visceral, an embodied recognition of the consequences of distancing, of detachment, and of emotional suppression. They feel it in their chest, in the ache left by absence, and in the longing for connection that lingers long after the empath is gone. This awareness is demanding because it requires honesty, courage, and vulnerability, the very qualities they have spent a lifetime avoiding. At the same time, this moment of self-awareness is also a turning point. It offers a path toward transformation, a possibility that the avoidant can emerge from the experience with greater emotional clarity and depth. They begin to understand that avoidance is not an inevitable state, that the patterns that govern their lives can be observed, questioned, and ultimately altered. The empathy they once received becomes a benchmark, a standard for the kind of emotional engagement they are capable of and deserve. The absence of the empath forces them to confront not only what they have lost, but also what they are capable of giving and receiving in the future. It is a painful, exacting process, but one that carries the potential for profound growth. Self-awareness for the avoidant is not a linear journey. It is uneven, filled with setbacks, resistance, and the recurring temptation to retreat back into familiar walls. Yet each moment of recognition, the awareness of fear, the acknowledgement of patterns, the confrontation with longing, is a step toward emotional maturity. The avoidant begins to see that pain, while destructive, is also instructive. It reveals the very truths that avoidance has concealed and points toward a path of authenticity they have rarely traveled. The empath's detachment, while painful, becomes a catalyst for this awakening, forcing the avoidant to reckon with themselves in ways they had long resisted and offering the possibility of a life lived with more openness, more honesty, and more connection. Healing after the super empath detaches is not a simple process for the avoidant, nor is it one that happens quickly or without struggle. For years, they have relied on distance, control, and detachment to manage emotions, and these patterns have become deeply ingrained. The moment the empath leaves, the avoidant is confronted with the consequences of those patterns, the absence of someone who truly understood them, the stark contrast between connection and isolation, and the profound realization of what they have denied themselves emotionally. The pain is immediate, intense, and in many ways unavoidable because the avoidant has rarely, if ever, been asked to confront themselves so fully. To heal, they must do what they have long resisted, step into the very discomfort that they have worked so hard to avoid, confront their emotions directly, and acknowledge the depth of what they are feeling without trying to control or suppress it. This process requires courage of a kind they may have never summoned before, and it begins with the acknowledgement that pain is not the enemy, but a guide. The first step toward healing is recognizing the reality of the loss. Avoidants are skilled at creating narratives that minimize emotional impact, at rationalizing distance, and at convincing themselves that what they feel is manageable or even irrelevant. But when a super empath detaches, the absence cannot be rationalized away. The avoidant must face the undeniable truth. They have lost someone who saw them fully, loved them deeply, and mirrored back the parts of themselves they have long tried to hide. Acknowledging this reality is painful because it requires admitting both longing and responsibility. The avoidant begins to see how their patterns of avoidance contributed to the loss, how retreating from vulnerability, withholding affection, or suppressing emotions created a chasm that the empath could no longer bridge. Healing begins here, with the raw confrontation of truth, and it is a step that cannot be skipped or softened. Once the reality of the absence is acknowledged, the avoidant must confront the emotions they have long buried. Fear, sadness, grief, longing, and regret emerge in full force, often all at once. These emotions can feel overwhelming because they are not just responses to the loss of another person. They are responses to the avoidant's own recognition of what they denied themselves. To face them requires a willingness to sit with discomfort, to experience emotional intensity without retreating, and to allow themselves to feel fully without judgment. Avoidants have spent a lifetime believing that controlling distance protects them from hurt, but healing demands the opposite: engagement with vulnerability. Each wave of emotion, each pang of grief is not a threat to be avoided, but a necessary part of the process, a signal that the heart is still capable of depth and that transformation is possible. Another essential component of healing is reflection on patterns and choices. Avoidants often see the consequences of their emotional avoidance in stark relief after a super empath leaves. They begin to trace the moments where they held back, retreated, or refused intimacy, recognizing how each decision contributed to the gap between what they desired and what they experienced. This reflection is challenging because it is both humbling and illuminating. The avoidant must confront their own limitations, their fears, and their habitual defense mechanisms, but in doing so, they gain clarity about the nature of their emotional architecture. They begin to understand not only what they avoided, but also why they avoided it. And this insight becomes a crucial foundation for growth. Healing is not about assigning blame. It is about developing awareness, taking ownership, and learning to navigate emotional territory differently in the future. Healing also requires cultivating self-compassion. Avoidants have a tendency to be harsh with themselves, viewing their avoidance as a personal failing rather than as a coping mechanism that once served a purpose. The departure of a super empath can trigger self-recrimination, guilt, and shame, which can exacerbate the pain and prolong emotional stagnation. True healing requires the avoidant to recognize that their patterns were developed for survival, that their fear of vulnerability was a protective instinct, and that mistakes or missed opportunities do not define their worth. By practicing self-compassion, the avoidant can soften the inner critique, create space for growth, and allow themselves to integrate the lessons of loss without being consumed by regret. This is a subtle yet essential part of the healing journey. Another critical aspect of healing is the willingness to embrace vulnerability in new ways. Avoidants have long associated intimacy with risk, believing that emotional exposure inevitably leads to pain. The absence of the empath highlights the cost of that belief, revealing that avoidance protects in the short term but amplifies pain in the long term. Healing requires the avoidant to experiment with openness, to practice expressing emotions honestly, and to step incrementally into connection without expecting perfection. It is a gradual process, often marked by discomfort and hesitation, but each attempt to engage authentically is a step toward rebuilding trust in themselves and in the possibility of love. The empath's absence becomes both a cautionary tale and a motivation. a reminder that vulnerability, though frightening, is necessary to avoid repeating the patterns that cause loss. Finally, healing involves integrating the experience into a broader understanding of self and relationships. The departure of a super empath is not just a loss, it is a profound lesson about the dynamics of connection, the cost of avoidance, and the potential for growth. The avoidant comes to see that love is not something to be controlled or avoided, but something to be engaged with fully, even at the risk of pain. They learn that emotional walls, while protective, are ultimately limiting, and that true fulfillment requires courage, presence, and the willingness to be known. Over time, the avoidant begins to internalize these lessons, cultivating resilience, self-awareness, and the capacity for deeper connection. Healing, therefore, is not a return to the state before the loss, but an evolution, an emergence into a more authentic, emotionally engaged self, capable of giving and receiving love without fear. And so, we come to the end of this journey through the hidden heart of the avoidant, through the silent storms that rage when someone who truly understood them detaches. What we have explored tonight is not just a story of loss, but a story of awakening. An awakening to the reality of our own hearts, to the patterns that shape our choices, and to the immense power of connection when it is met with courage and honesty. The pain we've spoken of is real, yes, but it is also instructive. It teaches, it reveals, and it challenges us to face ourselves, to confront our fears, and to grow beyond the limitations we have unconsciously imposed. It reminds us that love is not something to be managed, avoided, or contained. It is something to be experienced fully, with all its risk, all its beauty, and all its transformative power. To every avoidant listening tonight, know this: the pain you feel is not a sign of weakness, but a signal that your heart is alive, that you are capable of depth, and that the capacity for meaningful connection exists within you. To those who have ever loved deeply and been forced to step away, your impact is profound. You leave a mark, a mirror, and a reminder that when we are truly seen, we are also changed. And to everyone here, whether you identify as avoidant, empath, or somewhere in between, take this with you: understanding, compassion, and the willingness to confront the truths of our hearts are key gateways to healing, growth, and love that endures. Thank you all for sharing your time, your presence, and your openness tonight. Thank you for allowing yourself to feel, to reflect, and to consider the ways our hearts shape our lives. It has been an honor to explore this journey with you, and I hope you leave with not only awareness, but a sense of courage and possibility. Remember, pain is never wasted when it teaches us, and every ending is also a beginning, a chance to step forward with wisdom, authenticity, and the readiness to embrace the love we deserve. Thank you sincerely for listening. Thank you for being present. And may your hearts continue to grow, to feel deeply, and to find connection in its truest, most meaningful form.